Well, hello there, everyone. I didn't see that I didn't have my mic muted, although I wasn't speaking, so it was fine. Hello, it is Kristi. It's Sunday. I hope you are doing well and having a great day. This one is going to be kind of short. We're going to do a basic look at someone's take on patriarchy, an introductory text, and just kind of examine this perspective in light of my critique of the concept of patriarchy, which is that it doesn't represent the totality of how this structure has been built to not only control men and women, which is the false gender binary, but just generally sexuality, sexual identity, sexual orientation, behaviors, everything to do with that. And not in a criminal sense, I'm talking about like consensual things between hopefully adults, although I have a story to tell. I guess maybe I'll start with this, but can I just see, I want to get this off my chest. And that is, I had an exchange. It was a mistake. I went onto Twitter, what used to be called Twitter, and there's a right-wing notification, because I get a lot of just like when I do go onto the site to, in this case, do my thumbnail for my patriarchy, which I use their messaging system to move from one one device to another. Ended up getting in a conversation with somebody about Nick Fuentes and age of consent in marriage. And I'm just going to do a kind of whole skip to the end kind of thing because it's too long to get into. But the thing at the end of the day was that really got me. The conversation was turning on basically how old you have to be to consent to sex. And I take the position that we now know scientifically, human brains don't even mature until they're like in their early 20s. And we have really common things about turning 18 that seems to be, yeah, you've lived long enough to be held accountable for your actions, various things, right? So the idea of, I don't even like the idea of 18-year-olds getting married because you don't know what you're signing up for. But 17-year-olds, 16-year-olds, 15-year-olds, now we're getting into abuse, and it gets kind of gray as it goes down. But, okay, I'll summarize it with this. I know, skip to the end, too late. The person, I said, how old is old enough? Like 15, 16? Like, when do you think someone is actually like responsible enough to marry someone and have children? And they didn't give a straight reply. They replied with, my grandmother was 15 and had kids. And I'm probably going to get blocked by this person because my reply to them was, how does it make you feel to know that your grandmother was an abuse victim who had a child before she even finished the 10th grade? I mean, that was normalized in your family. You grew up in a family where a man sexually abusing his child bride was normal. And this is, I think, part of the problem of patriarchy. If you were to ask people, is a 16-year-old mature enough to raise a child? Is a 16-year-old economically grounded enough, financially, to have a child? We would, of course, say no. And we would, and you saw Nick Fuentes even, and they saying, oh, first 16, I want to go get a 16-year-old virgin. And then he bumped it up to 18 because it looks unappealing. People who have normalized that kind of sexual abuse and exploitation because they grew up with it. Like in their minds, they know 18 is like the start of when you could make that kind of choice. But in their heads, they think about, especially girls, as being baby machines, much younger, years younger, before they finish 10th grade, 11th grade, and that's kind of like the thing about patriarchy that's hard to unpack, is you have to get people to realize you were raised in a rape culture. You were normalized to think that raping a 15-year-old just because it happens inside of marriage is okay. And you need to sit with that idea for a while and think about that. And think about the implications that had for your entire family life, your dynamics, how you viewed men and women and girls and boys and non-binary people, right? We're dealing with some long-term indoctrination. Anyway, but when it comes to actually confronting this, again, I think understanding patriarchy from a framework of the control of human sexuality and not merely for the benefit of the control of all of human sexuality, for the benefit of a group of, and it tends to be in power, cisgendered, heterosexual men who also influence religion, economics, politics, and society. So there's like this small cadre of people who, men, they don't want their sexuality compromised, but they want everyone else to be held to a really high standard, and they want to be able to tell you who you can and can't sleep with, even though they're not part of it. That is the core of what I see as what patriarchy is really about. But let's compare that notion, which includes homophobia, transphobia, child bride, all of the kind of other stuff that goes along with human sexuality and like consent and lack of consent and viewing people as not of different worth. And then let's look at this introduction to patriarchy. So this, again, I'm not saying this to be mean. I'm not saying this is a bad article or anything. It just represents for me the mistakes you make when you have a false binary, when you have a false gender binary, and you're talking about patriarchy. All right, this is 8 minutes and 50 seconds in length, so it's not going to be too hard. I will, if it has any problems reading this out, I'll jump in, but otherwise I'll just go over this and kind of give my feedback, hopefully mostly at the end, but I tend to talk a lot, so I might interrupt. All right, check it out. Oh, I have to take off audio on mute though first in order so that you can hear it. That'll help.
Press.
Oh, here we go. Sorry, beginning.
What is patriarchy? By Alda Facio, translated from the Spanish by Michael Solis,
Seems a little loud.
2013.
I'll pull it back a bit.
The concept of patriarchy itself is not a contribution of feminist theories. Many social scientists in the 19th century wrote about it as a more civilized or complex form of organization compared to the primitive matriarchy one. Engels referred to it as the earliest system of domination, establishing that patriarchy is the world historical defeat of the female sex. Too, in this sense, it is said that patriarchy was a form of political organization that distributed power unequally between men and women to the detriment of women.
And so you can see that, like, from the start, we've always had a problem, in my opinion, because we've assumed the false gender binary. And then from that false assumption, the problems with the theory as a model to explain social behavior follows.
The Royal Academy of the Spanish Language Dictionary defines patriarchy as a primitive social organization in which authority is exercised by a male head of the family, extending this power even to distant relatives of the same lineage. Feminist theories updated and expanded the understanding of patriarchy in the second half of the 20th century. In fact, the social sciences had left it behind precisely because it was considered only to apply to and characterize ancient civilizations. But for many feminists, patriarchy is much more than civilizations that...
See, this is another part of that blindness. So I have to charge something, so I need to, like, plug something in over here. This is also part of that cultural blindness. Like, even though the exact same structures were in place in Engels' time, there was an economic structure, social structure, religious structure, political structure. They couldn't see their own patriarchal power. They couldn't, I mean, there was the biggest critique I saw in Engels' Family and the Origin of whatever it was, whatever Engels wrote, I'm sorry, I can't remember off the top of my head the full title, was he never talks about the way that the proletariat men are exploiting their wives, or the way the bourgeois men are exploiting their wives. It's always about capitalism being the exploiter, but the men were the ones benefiting from the unpaid labor. And that level of self-critique was just, nor was any addressing of that exploitation within the home and that exploitation of labor ever formally, like, really put into capitalism as a practice in terms of deconstructing hierarchies beyond the economic ones, you know?
that existed in the ancient past and goes beyond the unequal distribution of power between men and women in certain aspects of our societies, as many dictionaries still define it. On the contrary, most forms of feminism characterize patriarchy as a present-day unjust social system that subordinates, discriminates, or is oppressive to women. As Carol Pateman writes, the patriarchal construction of the difference between masculinity and femininity is the political difference between freedom and subjection.
The fact that, again, we don't even have a category for non-binary or, like, androgeneity shows the rigid nature of the cis-binary, dichotomy. And I understand that, like, there you can have well, here's the problem. Masculinity and femininity are not on opposite ends of a spectrum. They're individual spectrum. There's like hyper masculine in a culture to not possessing those characteristics at all, to hyper femininity in that culture to not possessing those characteristics at all. So when we try to pretend that masculinity and femininity are the spectrum, we're buying into the false gender binary and not having categories for non-binary or for androgynous, which are two different things in my mind. Then yeah, we're incomplete with our concepts and our models.
For me, the concept of patriarchy includes all the socio-political mechanisms, which I call patriarchal institutions, which reproduce and exert male dominance over women.
And here it's not male dominance over women, it's elite male control over human sexual behavior. Like there's this elite group that want to control what everybody else does in bed, and they get to benefit the most from that system. That's where the power exploitation comes in, because it's not like you couldn't have this with a homosexual exploitation either, right? Patriarchy is blind to that kind of abuse within a gender, or so. I said I wasn't going to talk. All right, I'm going to try to continue.
Feminist theory typically characterizes patriarchy as a social construction, which can be overcome by revealing and critically analyzing its manifestation for and institutions. Fixating on real and perceived biological differences between the two recognized sex five, men justify their domination on the basis of an alleged biological inferiority of women. Both feminist and non-feminist thinkers recognize that patriarchy has its historical origins in the family, the leadership of which is exercised. One, there is now evidence that the matriarchies these signs...
Oh, I'm just going to skip the footnotes because they interrupt the flow of the narrative. Just FYI. And also, PZ in the chat, hello. Your mom was 17 when she had you, and you were aware of how your family struggled. Exactly. This, I've really been, I guess, noticing this lately, how the framing of biology is used to justify sexual activity, as if puberty equates to sexual ripeness like a fruit. And I think it's a way to avoid the moral and ethical implications of not, of allowing 14-year-olds to get married or whatever else. So, when I was a teenager, when you were a teen, she finally got her GED and a job, which initially caused a lot of conflict in my family. Wow, that's amazing because, as I mentioned, I think in the last one, we know that education is one of the best predictors for like success for women and for their children, because women who have completed their education are able to pass that on to their kids. And so, yeah, waiting so long to get a GED and a job, my heart breaks for her, like, and her struggles. All right. That must have been so difficult. That's just the social pressures, like this is what you do to be a good girl, and this is what you do to be, like you stay home and put everyone else first. And then what happens if your husband gets injured and can't, anyway, I'm getting off track. We are going to continue on with this article. So we are saying it was leaving off the leadership and legal and practical of which is exercised by
the father and is projected to the entire social order, an order that is maintained and reinforced by different mechanisms/institutions, among them the institution of male solidarity. Through this institution, men as a social category, individually and collectively oppress all women as a social category.
Again, I think this better fits more ancient patriarchies, because there is patriarchy in modernity even when men as a group aren't actively oppressing women as a group. And how do you explain women who join the oppression of other women? Or how do you explain the existence of men who resist patriarchy? So I understand that the I think the Catholic churches are probably a more clarified version of this. Religions that only have men running stuff, I think this fits very well. I think it's more difficult to use this definition and apply it to a sort of, we call it like almost like a critical race theory approach. Yes, in the law, there is equality. In practice, in culture, there are still differences. And that is where the inequality is reproduced, even if it is being challenged occasionally or even righted by the legal structures in place.
but also oppress women individually in different ways, appropriating women's reproductive and productive force and controlling their bodies, minds, sexuality, and spirituality mainly through peaceful means such as the law and religion. However, often these peaceful means are reinforced through the use of physical, sexual, and/or psychological violence.
Those are all true.
Combining all of these elements of patriarchy, I define it as: patriarchy is a form of mental, social, spiritual, economic, and political organization/structuring of society produced by the gradual institutionalization of sex-based political relations created, maintained, and reinforced by different institutions linked closely together to achieve consensus on the lesser value of women and their roles. These institutions interconnect not only with each other to strengthen the structures of domination of men over women, but also with other systems of exclusion, oppression, and/or domination based on real or perceived differences between humans, creating states that respond only to the needs and interests of a few powerful men.
It's just too conspiratorial. This is why I don't like. This is why patriarchy, in my opinion, hasn't been like you're getting it, but you're not really getting it. Institutions can have, and of course this is an intro text, right? So we could talk about the actual formal institutions, and we could talk about informal practices, ritual, and culture. Like I said, this is partially right, but it's because it's so focused on this false binary and men as a group versus women as a group. I think it misses the real point of patriarchy, which is about control of everybody, including men, including, like everybody. All right, so gradual
institutionalization, I refer to a historical process that proves patriarchy is not natural, has not always existed,
correct.
and is not identical in all cultures and in all generations.
True.
This, in turn, means that although men have power over women in all institutions considered important in each society, it does not mean that women do not have any power or rights, influence or resources, nor does it mean that all women have or exert the same power. Moreover, as patriarchy becomes more sophisticated, more women of specific groups are allowed access to certain institutions, although they are almost never the most powerful people within those institutions. By sex-based political relations, I mean, as explained so well by Kate Millett, that sexual and other relations between the two sexes recognized as such by patriarchy are political relations through which men dominate women.
This is just so heteronormative. And again, intro text, but I think you need to be self-aware of, this was 2013. You need to be aware of the heteronormativity that you build into your models, because again, when you do this, you miss the homophobia that also links to this, and the transphobia. So again, I just like, this is a perfect example of how theorists working with the false gender binary are trying to capture the problem of patriarchy, but they're missing so much of it.
By consensus on the lesser value of women, I refer to a tacit and subconscious agreement between each member of a community that women and everything relating to women is worth less than men and everything relating to men. We see this reflected in the institution of sexist language, which establishes the feminine as the other and the male as the norm, and that which represents or contains the feminine.
True, but it's not just the male, is it? It's heterosexual. In the West, he's usually white. Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of other norms that are bound up with this that are going unstated here. Or not norms, values that are going unstated here through heteronormativity and trans exclusion.
By consensus, I also make reference to an ideology and its expression in language that explicitly devalues women, assigning them, their roles, their work, their products, and their social environment less worth and or power than that assigned to men. By patriarchal institutions, I refer to the set of mechanisms, practices, beliefs, myths, and relationships organizing relatively stable patterns of human activity with respect to the distribution of resources, the reproduction of individuals, and the type of societal structures within a given patriarchy. These institutions are closely linked with one another, creating, maintaining, and transmitting inequality from generation to generation. Most sociologists recognize as institutions such social structures as governments, the family, human languages, universities, hospitals, business corporations, and legal systems. I prefer to rename these recognized institutions.
It's good to be clear, but this is getting really boring for me. But it's good to be clear in your language. Right, agreed.
With more appropriate names such as the institution of androcentric law, the institution of misogynist religion or of sexist language, of male-stream media or male-centered science.
But the thing is, by drawing attention, like again, I get this and I agree. All right. These are all valid things. But by bringing attention to androcentric law or misogynist religion, you're omitting homophobia. You're omitting transphobia. And so, yeah, that's my point.
etc. But I also like to make visible other institutions which patriarchal sociology does not recognize as such, like the institution of male solidarity, of history with capital H, of erotic violence, of woman-blaming myths, of malaheteronormativity, of
Okay, we got male heteronormativity in there.
dichotomous sexual beings,
Dichotomous sexual beings. I think this is starting to hint at it, but these are considered like side issues, So anyway, there's a hint here. There's a hint here. That's good. Oh, I thought I hit play. I did not. Let me fix that.
etc. Many feminists, while not speaking of institutions per se, argue that patriarchy exists not only in the family but in all structures that allow for control over women, their work, and reproductive force. I call these structures patriarchal institutions because aside from being mechanisms for the perpetuation of patriarchy, they are also a set of beliefs, practices, myths, relationships, etc., which make sure that patriarchy is invisible even to those women which suffer the most exclusion or at the most, make sure it is perceived as natural or simply as the way things are and always will be for women. I borrow the idea of the institution of male solidarity from Celia Amoros, although she does not call it this and speaks instead of a brotherhood among men that takes place in the constitution of modern patriarchy. The Costa Rican composer/singer Guadalupe Urbina refers to this institution as the knighthood of mutual praise. Marcella Lagarde, Angela Miles, Carol Pateman, and many other feminists also believe that men create interdependence and solidarity among themselves, which enables them to dominate women. This does not mean that there is no hierarchy among men. The appropriation of women's reproductive force and the control of their bodies and their sexuality comes from radical feminism. For example, Shulamith Firestone discusses how human reproduction, which happens in women's bodies, is legally appropriated and controlled by men and is used to benefit men or to keep women at the mercy of men.
Again, I think these are valid, but of course, written in the time that they were, it's being exclusionary to people, like non-binary people and trans people who also get pregnant. So again, it's kind of suffering from its own blindness. So I'm just going to point that out.
Lydia Falcon considers women as a social and economic class, insisting that it is the father and her husband who enforce the appropriation. Many feminists, such as Maria Mice and others, have spoken of the productive relationship between husband and wife in the modern nuclear family, which is similar to the relationship between a supervisor and a subordinate in the workplace. This subordination occurs in the private space of family because whatever the husband produces enters the market, the privileged area of capitalist patriarchy, while the wife's production is not. In this way, all of the wife's work in the non-privileged private space of the nuclear family is invisibilized. Some aspects, elements, or characteristics of modern patriarchy are the following. 1. Patriarchy.
So we've got to some numbered list here. There isn't anything in here about the way that patriarchy will elevate, or at least there are motives in patriarchy to elevate women who engage in their own, like the justification and normalization of their own oppression, the pick-me types, which I guess is probably not necessary in an introduction, but if you think about it, you might come up with it. So maybe by the end, she'll mention that patriarchy does not exclusively rely on men to justify anything, and that there are on-ramps and on-roads for women to engage in the kind of rhetoric and discourse and reproduction of values to keep patriarchy going too, right? Because it's disproportionately like mothers who spend the most time raising their kids. And so if it's only men reproducing patriarchy, we probably wouldn't have it. So obviously there are women and other people too who act against their group self-interest by trying to advance their individual interest. Okay.
Patriarchy had a beginning and therefore can have an end, even if we still do not know how exactly it came into being. We do know it came about after millenniums of different, more egalitarian human organizing. The earliest forms of patriarchy only began at the most 6 millenniums ago. 2. We also know that there are different models of patriarchy at different times and in different cultures and places, but the lower value given to women and their roles as compared to men and their roles remains constant in all models.
True. Again, we're kind of making a lot of groups invisible here by only looking at the roles. I've already done my critique. You've heard it.
In other words, patriarchy coexists with very different forms of government and socio-religious political organizing such as empires, kingdoms, theocracies, republics, democracies, etc., and can coexist very well with capitalism, socialism, etc. However, due to the globalization of neoliberal capitalism, almost all existing patriarchies today can be categorized as capitalist patriarchies.
Okay.
3. In all known patriarchy, negative meanings are attributed to women and their activities through symbols and myths. These symbols and myths are different in different cultures, but within each culture they attribute negative meanings to women or the feminine.
It's just a slightly simplistic thing. There are ways that values about women can appear to elevate them and put them on pedestals while also excluding them. So this is about negative meaning to women or the feminine. There was this whole anti-suffrage discourse that women are too pure for politics. Women, are much more moral creatures, and politics is very dirty. And by allowing women to vote, they would be getting into the dirtiness of politics, and they're too good for that. It's a way to elevate someone while also disempowering them, and it's not necessarily negative, although the effects are negative. It's meant to hide that kind of like paternalism. So I just want to point out, because some of the language here is a little too over, like, what is the word I'm looking for? When you like use never, always, it's just, you're not allowing for some of the grayness of what the real world is like.
4. Patriarchy is made up of structures or institutions that exclude women from participation in or contact with spaces of higher power, or what are believed to be the spaces of greatest power economically, politically, culturally, and religiously.
I don't think this is the case, though. I mean, even in 2023, I feel that this isn't incorrect. You do have women in places of power. It's just all the baggage with patriarchy goes with them. When a woman runs for office, she's asked, what are you going to do about your time with your kids when she's standing for office? A guy never does. Even if she wins, she'll, can do all the same things, but she might be held to a different standard because she's a mother. And so it's not about exclusion. It's always about this differentiation and double bind women often find themselves in when trying to be both liberated and comply with traditional oppression.
5. Despite the above, women are not treated identically in patriarchy, nor are all women excluded in the same way from spaces of power. In fact, this different treatment is a mechanism by which the lack of solidarity and competitiveness among women is promoted. This lack of solidarity and competitiveness among women sometimes escalate to outright contempt for each other, thus ensuring their loyalty to men and male values.
I don't know, this is whole like men can cooperate because they hunt and women didn't so they can't bull that we came across. Men gets to have solidarity, but women, I don't know, that just doesn't ring right with me. Not happy with 5.
Patriarchy is produced by and at the same time promotes a mindset based on dichotomous, hierarchical, and sexualized thinking.
Yeah. Yeah. And that's wrong. Does anyone else see it?
This mindset divides reality into two.
Sib, that's a good point about women are too moral is an infuriating excuse to maintain corrupt systems. Yes. We don't want reformers in there. We don't want people who might change the system up a little bit.
Dichotomous categories placing all of perceived reality either into things and acts associated with nature or things and acts produced by culture. Furthermore, everything placed within the category culture is overvalued while everything associated with nature is undervalued. By situating men and the masculine under the higher category of culture, and woman and the feminine under the less valued category of nature, man and masculinity become the parameter, model, or paradigm of humanity, while the subordination of women is justified based on their alleged inferior natural roles.
Which I totally agree with, but it's not a dichotomy. So you need to bust that down too.
In patriarchy, gender roles and stereotypes may be different in each social class, age, and culture, but through the mechanisms, structures, and institutions mentioned previously, it makes these roles and stereotypes seem natural and universal. 8.
Okay.
In any given patriarchy, all men will not enjoy the same privileges or have the same power. Indeed, the experience of domination of men over women historically served for some men to extend that domination over other groups of men, installing a hierarchy among men that is more or less the same in every culture or region today. The male at the top of the patriarchal hierarchy has great economic power, is an adult and almost always able-bodied, possesses a well-defined, masculine gender identity and a well-defined heterosexual identity, adding a few more features by region.
I have the same critique that I've had this entire time about what this piece misses, so I'll just keep
For
going.
example, in Latin America,
Don't care. You can read that.
across
I want to get
patriarchy's
going,
different
so
models,
I'll skip it up.
women are exposed to different degrees and types of violence, some common to all and others specific to each cultural, religious, or economic model adopted by the patriarchy.
Okay, but it's not just women. I mean, men are exposed too. Because again, homosexual men or people who are trans are subjected to the same patriarchal violence that cis straight women are.
10. Patriarchy was the first structure of domination, subordination, and exclusion which is recognized as such by history with a capital H and still remains a basic system of domination. Ironically, while being the most powerful and enduring system of inequality, it is hardly ever perceived as such even by women themselves. In fact, precisely because the invisibilization of patriarchy is one of its institutions, even some feminists deny its existence.
What? I don't need this ad. What? Okay. All right. And that was it. That's the end of the piece. Again, it was just a little intro piece. And I do think that the author made a good faith effort, clearly had read, clearly had thought, clearly had engaged with law and Marxist critique and other fields as well when putting this together. I just think that it sets itself up for failure by missing the point. Patriarchy isn't about men controlling women. It's about men, like we say, like in a small, like at the top, controlling everybody's like sexuality. That's what I think it really is what we're missing. And sexuality includes how many genders are, allowed to exist. What kind of sexual orientations are not criminalized. That is, like whether like the who can have affairs, who can initiate divorce proceedings, who keeps the children in these divorce, once if there's a divorce, all of that kind of stuff is, I think, bound up with patriarchy. So it's far more than just a group controlling another group, or there being a hierarchy within men. It's a way more complicated than this. But they tried. So that was it, really. I just kind of wanted to, having spent some time with my ideas about patriarchy and then looking back to see what other people are saying. Like I said, that there's this whole gap in the conceptualization. And I don't see that. I think the problem is if you take like transphobia and homophobia and you leave them separate from patriarchy, you miss the moral outrage that underpins the moral authority that was being tried to claim to control all of these people. And that's what is underpinning patriarchy. All right, so autonomy might be better. I can't see. Oh, so I can go over. I can do the chat now. Yeah, look at me. I made a I made a chat window. Woohoo! The problem, Corey, is that I can't see what you've written because there's a stupid heart in the way, and it's covering up your last word. I can see autonomy would be a better more broad term than limiting it to just sexuality. Yeah, I mean, possibly. I think because I'm thinking specifically of like activities and reproduction and stuff. If you, so Scribby writes, if I don't know if you've heard of the 3 essays by Marie Lejeune de Gournay, Equalities of Men and Women, written in 1641. Ladies' Complaint and Apology for the Women Writing. That one I don't know. All right. That's your dose of anti-patriarchy like content for this week. And I will actually, you know what? I won't be back next week. I'm taking next week off. I'm just going to declare it now. I'll put a thing in the Discord, making a note that I won't be around next week. I have an out-of-town guest, and I won't be doing like show prep. I'm entertaining. Then I think that's really about it. So the next time we will see each other will be on, I guess, the 27th or the 26th, if I can get my act together on the Saturday. If you haven't yet, there is a live link for the Discord group It's a pretty quiet group. I post stuff. People, it's not a lot of demands on your time, but there is a group for this. I saw PZ had sent me a message, so I will try to get in touch with him so we can book that evaluation of that evolutionary theory piece that is way too long, but is also very interesting. And with that, I guess all that's left to be said is that I've been Kristi. You've been awesome. You can check me out every Friday night on Twitch with Kevin over on his channel. You can also check out our Rolling Left D&D channel. I said I've been Kristi. You've been awesome. Have a good afternoon, good morning, or good evening, wherever it is, whenever it is you are, and we'll see each other again really soon. All right, stay well till then.